and before I begin, I take this opportunity to thank all the people who have logged in for this webinar today. A very quick introduction to the Indian Society for Clinical Research. We are a professional association that is dedicated to establishing clinical research as a discipline in India. We work across various areas of clinical research such as science, ethics, regulations, and at the heart of whatever we do, we have the patient safety and data integrity. So I would encourage those of you who are not familiar with Indian Society for Clinical Research to visit our website and learn more about our activities, and of course any suggestions that you have for us in making clinical research and patient safety better in the country are most welcome. With that, let me dive straight into the topic of today, and a lot is about clinical trials, whether we as a country need clinical trials, we don't need clinical trials. So I want to first talk, start this webinar by talking about what are clinical trials. And what clinical trials mean in the context of drug development. Now we all know that, I'm sure each one of us have taken drugs sometime during our life. We have family members who are on drug treatments for chronic and acute illnesses, but we should also think about what the overall drug development process is. The pill that we pop, without thinking much, once, our doctor tells us to do so. How does that pill get established as a drug? What are the things that it goes through, and what role do clinical trials really play in that process? So drug development is a very long and complex process. On an average, it takes 12 to 15 years for a compound or a biologic to be established as a drug safe for human use. If we were to test 10,000 different substances identified as potential medicines or potential drugs intended for human use, only about 10 of them will be successful and will really see the light of the day in the clinic or at the patient's bedside. So that's the kind of success rate and time frame that we are talking about. And obviously, given this success rate and this time frame, it shouldn't be surprising that cost of developing one single new medicine ranges anywhere from 800 million to 1.7 billion US dollars. So it's a very time and resource extensive proposition. And clinical trials, which play a very vital role in the whole drug development process, because clinical trials are means to prove the safety and effectiveness of a drug when it is undergoing the testing. So what we do in clinical trial is it's actually a medical research experiment that determines the safety and effectiveness of a medicine or treatment and discovers any side effects. So in other words, unless we put a potential drug or a potential medicinal substance through a clinical trial, we will not be able to say very definitively whether, first of all, it is effective, it is really going to have an impact on the drug area that we intend to treat, and secondly, whether it is safe. So the safety and the efficacy go hand in hand when we talk about clinical trial. And many a times, if you see history of drug development, safety always takes precedence. So we have had to shelve drug development projects of highly effective medicines at times because there were some safety concerns. So when we are talking of clinical trials and when we are talking of a new medicine or a new treatment, it may be new and not tested in human being before, or it can be an existing one that we may want to use in a new way. So for example, there is a particular dosage form of a certain drug, it's established already, and we may want to use a different dosage form. That also technically becomes a new drug and must go through extensive clinical trials. Why should you do clinical trials? I mean, the question people will often ask is that clinical trials are, after all, experiments, and can we not do something else whereby drug development can happen without clinical trials? And the answer, at least today, is no. Because when a new drug development process happens, It all starts in the lab where several molecules or several medicinal substances undergoing extensive screening for their pharmacological effect. Once you have a potential candidate, it goes through a battery of tests that get conducted first in tissue systems and then in animals. And once we come to a stage that we have enough pharmacological data, safety and efficacy data in all these in vitro cell models and animal models, only then we think of doing the study in humans. But study in human beings is not something we can avoid today, because after all our biological systems are different than all the animals we can possibly test the drug in. And today at least there is no computer simulation available which will mimic human body, and therefore will determine how human body will deal with the drug and the drug will deal with human body. In other words, clinical trials are a must if we have to bring new drugs to market today. And the reasons, the questions that we ask ourselves in clinical trials are many. Of course, the primary question is to find out if a new medicine or a drug device, or it can even be a new diagnostic tool, whether it is safe and effective. How does it compare vis-a-vis existing treatments, and which is better? Because if I'm going to bring something that is inferior to or comparable to well-established treatments, why bother and go through this whole series of testing? It obviously has to be better in terms of safety and efficacy compared to the existing treatments. In other words, it has to give answer to an unmet medical need. One also wants to study different ways to use already existing treatment, which can be more effective, easier to use, and have decreased side effects. And one potential way of doing it can be to evolve or to find out different drug delivery systems. For example, you may have a drug which is very effective, but when taken orally, it causes irritation in the stomach. Then we can use a different kind of coating substance while administering this drug, and we can give the drug in such a way that it's a tablet or a capsule that only dissolves in the intestine. This is a very simple example that I can give here. The other way, or the other important aspect that one wants to often evaluate in a clinical trial is to see how best to use the treatment in different population in which the treatment has not previously been tested. Now, whenever we are inventing a new drug, the first target population is always the adult patients who are more or less similar. But then there are various subgroups. There are children, there are very elderly patients, there are patients with severe complications, and one cannot simply extrapolate data from one patient group to another. The other very important aspect, as drug development has largely become a global phenomenon now, is how different ethnicities behave to a same drug. And we have instances in the history of drug development whereby one particular drug was found highly efficacious in people of a certain ethnicity, but did not have any impact on the groups who were ethnically different. So all these answers are important when one is talking about clinical trials, and the aim is really to make sure that we are giving our end consumers a medicine that is safe, effective, and we can also advise the consumers as to how exactly they should take the medicine. And all of you will know that there are certain medicines we are supposed to take on empty stomach. There are some which we take only with meals. Some have to be taken after certain hours of meal. All these things, they actually these are all information that one gets through clinical trials. Let's come to now clinical trials with respect to India and what have been, some important milestone when it comes to clinical trials in India. So clinical trials as a discipline is rather new to India, and we have, if I look at history of global clinical trials in India, it started in late 90s, but the real growth in clinical trials in India only started happening in 2005, when the clinical trial regulations in India were made more homogeneous with the rest of the world. And it was that time that the clinical trial phase lag was removed, which meant that India could participate in global clinical trials along with the rest of the world. In hindsight, when I look back on the growth of clinical research in India, from 2005 onwards, when the regulations got harmonized, there was an exponential increase in the number of clinical trials that were taking place in the country. But what did not grow in the same proportion were the measures to really regulate and control those clinical trials from a governance perspective. And as a result, there were several questions asked of the patient safety, the patients who were enrolled in clinical trial. There was not adequate mechanism to demonstrate that they were really safe, their well-being was being taken care of, and that the data in the clinical trial could be really trusted to that extent. And that caused lot of questions being asked of the regulators from parliaments, from press, from patient interest group. And what happened then was a series of new regulators came up. Now, while these regulations were all brought about with the intent of improving patient safety, what happened was, because of the background against which they were brought about, there was no time to do appropriate stakeholder consultation or provide guidance on how these actually have to be implemented. As a result, there was a lot of confusion in the system, there were delays in clinical trial approvals, and then there were some regulations which were not really balanced. And all this meant that clinical research in India started going down. But against the setback of challenges, there have been consistent advocacy whereby we have been successful in collaborating with the regulators and all the stakeholders of clinical research process. And today what we see is that the regulations are much more balanced, and while the regulatory scenario in last 2 to 3 years has been dominated by media and social activism, action in the parliament, and regulations which were not very balanced, today we see a complete change and the regulations are much more structured. The advocacy for clinical research seems to have succeeded in driving home the message that India as a country definitely needs clinical trials, and we have today the regulations which are much more balanced. The regulatory approval timelines are much more predictable, and there are measures planned in the system to improve stakeholder confidence, such as the accreditation. And today therefore we are sitting on a much more conducive clinical trial environment when it comes to the clinical research. So we have seen a lot of developments on the regulatory front, but as I said, in 2015, DCGI in fact started his New Year message to say that 2015 will be the year of streamlining of the regulatory procedures without compromising with patient safety. And this is what we indeed see happening. And if we have to compare pre-2015 and 2016 scenario across various aspects of regulations, let us see where we are. So first of all, I would want to talk about the new regulations which have been introduced, and one regulation which really impacted clinical research in the country, and I wouldn't say clinical research industry here, I would say clinical research, because this regulation not only impacted the industry, but it also impacted academic clinical trials, which are so important for finding out answers which are relevant to a country as a society, because that is something that takes into consideration our unique healthcare needs. So compensation guidelines were introduced in January 2013, and while we all would agree without any bias that compensation must be provided for clinical trial related injury that happens during and due to conduct of a particular clinical trial, the guidelines which were introduced in 2013 were unfortunately very open-ended and therefore open to misuse and litigation. That has changed, and today we have guidelines which are very well balanced in the interest of patient safety, making sure that if there is a research related injury, medical management is made available to the patient immediately. The compensation guidelines also make sure that the contentious, it is not contentious, and the sponsor or the innovator is not penalized if there's an injury happening that has got no correlation with clinical trial whatsoever. And what we also have, one very unique thing about our regulation is that we have very well defined formulae for calculation of compensation. So on one side we have compensation guideline that is balanced, and on the other hand we have clear formulae to say that if the event is of a certain kind, what compensation should be given. The other important development has been the review process, and when the regulations were undergoing changes, the regulatory approval timeline was as long as 8 to 18 months, and when we look at 2015 average, that has come down to 6 months across the industry. So that's a huge improvement, and that has been possible because of the expansion in the number of subject expert committees by the regulators and a commitment of the regulators to bring the review and approval time down by making sure that all the review meetings that are necessary for clearance of a particular clinical trial or a new drug approval happen. There are also other important operational kind of aspects which are under consideration. Currently, there's a limit, excuse me, on the number of studies that an investigator can undertake. And again, while this has been brought about with the good intent to make sure that one particular investigator does not engage himself in a far too many research projects than he can successfully manage, there has to be a little more thought process given, and the thinking of the regulators is to ensure that the ethics committee really decides how much a researcher should take up. And we hear that a regulation to this effect will be announced very soon. The AV recording in India of informed consent discussion. This is again a very unique requirement of India, and because of certain irregularities which were observed in the informed consent process in certain trials, it was kind of made compulsory by the regulators that for all clinical trials, patients who were getting enrolled in clinical trials, when they were having discussion with their investigators about their participation, what we call as informed consent discussion, that had to be audiovisually recorded. Now, while again here it is done with good intention, we do believe that we could take a more selective approach, and that is what exactly is the current scenario, whereby we have now informed consent, audiovisual recording of informed consent being necessary only for vulnerable subjects and for trials involving new medicinal entity. There is also a lot of parity now about the type of sites that should participate in a study, and this decision is now left to the sponsor of the study, who is responsible for ensuring that the right type of sites participate in clinical research. Clinical research, while it is a science, it's also a very emotive subject, and the public perception here matters a lot, and therefore stakeholder management and management of public perception is a very, very important aspect of clinical research. And there I feel that a measure by the regulators such as accreditation, whereby all ethics committees, investigators and sites that want to participate in clinical trial having to undergo an accreditation process, is a very important step in building confidence of the stakeholder and improving public perception of the clinical trials, and that is what we hope will happen in the coming months. Given this background, and given that the future of clinical trials, or sorry, at least the regulations governing clinical trials is more or less balanced now, and we have our lessons learned from our past, where do we go from here? And here, when we talk to different stakeholders about clinical research, people often ask us that, why do people have to come to India for doing clinical trials? Why can all these global companies not do the trials elsewhere? So the choice of the countries where a study has to happen is governed by various factors, and there is a very common misconception that because India as a destination for clinical trials is a low-cost destination, all drug companies are rushing into India to do clinical trials, and that's an absolute myth. Typically, a particular company or a particular academic entity, when they decide to do a clinical trial, it has to essentially happen in countries which are, after all, end markets of that particular new drug or therapy or diagnostic test, because in different countries the ethnicity of people will differ, and unless you have the drug or the new diagnostic tool tested in the particular population where you ultimately want such new treatment to be available, you cannot really go ahead. So the choice of country is not definitely governed by cost, but really where the end users of the drug are residing. So epidemiology and the disease prevalence becomes a very important factor. Also, what is important is access to qualified investigators, because clinical research, doing a clinical research is not like conducting your usual clinical practice. So in a country you may have highly trained medical practitioners, but unless they are trained to be clinical research investigators, you really cannot go there. So choice of India, or when India gets into a global clinical trial, this decision is driven by various factors, and also to make sure that as a country does markets. And one mustn't forget that we are a country after all with not only just a very high population but a very high disease burden. And just to give you a perspective, India has 17% of the global population but 20% of the global disease burden. So we are first of all a multi-ethnic, multi-racial population. Genetically we are very different to the Oriental population in the rest of Asia or the Caucasian population for that matter. We have ethnicity of our own. We have a very high disease burden, and this is actually described as a triple burden of diseases by the Government of India Working Group on Disease Burden. And it's a no-brainer that we are a developing country, so we have very high incidence of communicable diseases like tuberculosis, leprosy, vector-borne diseases, nutritional disorders, so on and so forth. But we are seeing in India today a very distinct socio-economic transformation, whereby more and more people are moving from rural areas to urban areas, and that is giving rise to a very distinct change in lifestyle, bringing along with it emerging non-communicable lifestyle diseases such as cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, etc. Then we are also part of the global economy today, where there are emergent infections like Ebola virus, SARS, H1N1, for which globally there is no satisfactory answer available. So if we have to really treat our triple disease burden, if we have to make sure that our huge disease burden is answered in a satisfactory way, we need to have a healthcare agenda of our own, and that is never going to be complete unless we really look at what are needs of our population and be part of clinical trials which are trying to answer these questions for us, and which are trying to bring drugs to us which will help us really address our lesser disease, our great disease burden. And let's look at the number of trials that happen in India vis-a-vis our huge disease burden. So today if we see all the trials happening across the globe, less than 1.4% of those actually are conducted in India today. Current statistics from clinicaltrials.gov, this is a US FDA website, and all studies which are done under a US IND, they need to register on these website. So this is a very reliable data. So currently there are 2,15,433 trials happening in 178 countries across the globe. Out of that, we 841 studies, and that's a statistics that is really worrying, because if you see this map here, it indicates the trials that are happening across the world, and you will see that the areas where most trials are happening is US and Europe, and many other geographies within Asia are doing much better than us. Even Latin American countries are doing better than us. So it's not really about the numbers really, but then if the question is really, if this remains our participation in clinical trials, how do we really make sure that we will have drugs that address our need as a society, as a country, given our unique needs and given our disease burden. So where do we really go from here? I think we have a situation in India today where we have the disease. I mean, there can be no second thoughts about it, that we have patients, and those patients are waiting for newer healthcare modalities and they're waiting for access to healthcare. We have very well trained investigators. The investigators in India, the amount of clinical material that they see is unmatched when you look at any other geography in the world, and the kind of clinical expertise that we have is something we should be extremely proud of as a country. When we look at clinical trial regulations, yes, we've been through a lot, but today the regulations are largely balanced and the environment is conducive to clinical trials. So I think now it's up to us to make sure that we reach out to the rest of the world and make sure that more and more clinical research comes to India. We give this message to our Indian innovators to make sure that they have a research agenda which actually supports the healthcare needs of our country, and we make sure that we give this message to the academicians so that they do research which is relevant for our country. So that's where I think, where we are, and some of the measures that will really help in taking this agenda forward in a very meaningful way is one thing is accreditation. We did talk about it, and this is something that will bring huge confidence in the system, and various stakeholders will feel more comfortable if a objective program like this is launched. And the other thing is, the infrastructure development. I mean, if we can invest in better infrastructure, particularly in government-run hospitals, we'll make sure that, many patients across the country will have access to clinical trial sites, and the regulatory capacity building remains one more aspect. Trials start happening in the country. Not only do we need robust approval mechanism, but we also need to make sure that we have a very robust governance on the clinical trials which are happening on the ground. In other words, on one side we have an approval mechanism which works seamlessly, and secondly we need a governance mechanism which will make sure that the trials which are happening on the ground, they're happening for the current regulations, for the necessary scientific and ethical norms, and that the patients in these trials are safe. So these are some of the key things. One cannot also really overemphasize the need for public education and awareness. Today there is lot of myths around about clinical research, and even educated people are asking questions about, do we really need clinical trials, and clinical trials can only happen in the Western world and we can simply adopt that result. And that's an indication that people really do not know what are clinical trials, what is drug development, and how we can really make a difference by being part of these trials. And here is where we as ISCR are committed to work with our partners in media and making sure that patients understand, common public understand what clinical trials mean to our country, and also to bring about awareness as to what are the rights of the patients when they participate in clinical trials. Because clinical trials, no matter where they happen in the world, they are bound by very, very stringent ethical norms, and even unknowingly an investigator should not violate the rights of the patients who participate in clinical trials. So that's the awareness we are we are committed to bring about. On the other hand, if we can have greater transparency and openness by the regulators in terms of showcasing what all they have done in terms of balancing regulatory environment, what all they have done in terms of making sure that the regulations are going to remain balanced, what have they done in terms of implementing some of the newer systems and regulations such as compensation, that will further boost this confidence. And again, as ISCR, we have been working in partnership with regulators, and we are committed to continue our work. So with that, we will wrap up the slides and we'll open the session for questions, if any. Thank you. Any questions?
We have already shared with you a couple of questions.
Okay, they are just coming. Okay, so there are a couple of questions here, and for the benefit of all the attendees, I will first read the question, and then we can answer those. So the first question is, speaking about timelines, we see that the subject expert committees, technical committees and apex committee meetings are held irregularly. Can you please comment on this, and would you be able to give us a breakup of timeline? Okay, so thank you for that question, Kirti. So basically how the system functions, what we have seen is that the subject expert committee meetings happen when they have sufficient kind of applications for discussion for a SEC for a particular therapy area. Once the proposal is cleared by subject expert committee, technical committee takes over, and then finally it goes to apex committee. Now, we as applicants do not have visibility as to how technical committee and apex committee meetings will be scheduled, and that is definitely the prerogative of the DCGI. But what we have seen, at least when we look at 2015, that the approval timelines were about 6 months overall, which is a very good improvement over 2014 and 2013. Also, we have given the feedback time and again to DCGI. For example, early this year, we saw that no technical committee meeting was scheduled for a long time. We gave that feedback, and there was immediate action by the Drugs Controller's Office. Just today, actually, there has been, another office order issued, whereby we have all been asked to comment on how the regulations can be further eased. So yes, while the system evolves, we will see certain ups and downs, but overall, the regulators are committed, and at least as of now, we have not seen major deviation from the timeline that we have seen in the 6 months. So I hope that answers your question, Kirti. The next question is, if a study do not involve vulnerable population in NCE, then AV is not required. Is a cancer patient participating in a study considered vulnerable? This is a question by Rajesh CN. Thank you for that question, Rajesh. So basically, whether a patient is vulnerable or no will not be decided simply by his or her disease condition. Here, his socio-economical background will play a very large role. For example, if this cancer patient does not have a means of income and is dependent on his family for his livelihood, then according to me, this patient will be a vulnerable patient. Secondly, we must also remember that even if the patient is not vulnerable, and if the trial tests a new medicinal entity, then audiovisual recording will still be required. What our request to the regulators is been, Rajesh, that they should come up with a clear guidance of what will be defined as vulnerable, so that there is no subjectivity in deciding whether a particular subject is vulnerable or not, and also come up with a very clear definition of what would be considered as a new medicinal entity. Because if you see the drugs and cosmetic rules, nowhere the term new medicinal entity is defined. The new drug definition is very clear, but new medicinal entity, this is a new term as far as the law is concerned, and therefore for the purpose of better clarity, we have asked the regulators to come up with a kind of a gazette notification or an office order, whatever they deem fit, where both these terms get very clearly defined. But yes, I mean, to answer your question in specifically, really you must look at the overall socioeconomic background and the disease condition of the particular patient to determine whether he or she is vulnerable or no, and if a guidance is available, then it will definitely help. So thanks for that question, Rajesh. The next question is from Sridhar, and he wants to know, how long do you think it will take to improve the number of trials in India? So this is an interesting question, and we know that we have been through a lot of roller coaster in last 3 years. Today, what we see is that many academic institutions and companies are interested to bring trials back in India in a big way, because there is a lot of potential here. I mean, if you just look at the expertise of the investigators and the clinical material, no country in India today can really, no country in the world can really match India. But by the time all these trials, people find sites, the trials undergo the regulatory approval, ethics approval, and we start. I think it's going to be definitely till the end of this year. And I think it's also up to all of us, and all of you, I assume there are many clinical research professionals here on this call, and it's really up to them to take this message back to the rest of the world, to make sure that we give this message to the world that India as a country needs clinical trials. And today we have regulations in India which are balanced, and in certain aspects the regulations in India are far more robust than regulations elsewhere, and I think the world needs to know it, and more effectively we convey this message, faster will be the turnaround of clinical trials in India. So thanks, Sridhar, for that question. Next question is by Nivedita, and she says that we have been hearing that the 3-study cap for investigators will be either relaxed or removed. Can you kindly share, can you, I'm not sure if that question got moved, one sec, okay. Can you kindly share some recent updates on this if available with you? This has been a long-standing debate with the regulators, Nivedita, and in principle, the regulators have agreed that 3 as a cap does not mean anything, and really how much of research work an investigator should undertake should be rightly decided by the institutional ethics committees, because as we know, research at a particular institution is governed by the ethics committee of that institution. They have first-hand information about the expertise of the investigator, the infrastructure available, resource available to him, and therefore regulators do believe that the ethics committee should be made responsible for determining how much or how many trials an investigator should undertake. And we do hear that an office order is likely to come out to this effect very soon, and we are actually awaiting this office order. So, in summary, we have in principle agreement that this norm has to be removed. Ethics committee has to be empowered to decide how much investigators should undertake, but we'll have to wait for that particular office order. Okay, the other question is, any comments on the draft biosimilar guidelines specific to requirement of 100 patients on test arm? This is a question by Ranjit, and thank you, Ranjit, for that question. So basically, biosimilar guidelines is something that, a lot of work has happened in this area already. And one has to, understand that biosimilar present a huge opportunity for our country. One is, of course, the commercial aspect of it, where the Indian innovator companies have an opportunity to really contribute to global healthcare by way of their biosimilars. Secondly, biosimilars make affordable healthcare possible, and that's something is very relevant for us, given the socio-economic background of our patients. And I feel that the biosimilar guidelines need to make sure that while we are trying to ease out certain aspects of introduction of biosimilars, we do not dilute the whole testing and the patient safety parameter. And that's where I feel that we should not restrict, we should not be prescriptive about whether the study should be done in 100 patients or 200 patients. What we really need is, a robust guideline that looks at the disease indication under study, that looks at the sites which are participating, that looks at really what is that statistical parameter or statistical significance that you're trying to study, and accordingly should have a provision to determine the sample size. Similarly, some other things like immunogenicity testing, etc., should not be taken lightly. So in summary, Ranjit, what I would say is that these guidelines should facilitate more biosimilar research and development in the country, but at the same time it should not dilute, so that it looks like that Indian guidelines are much more dilute compared to rest of the world. So I hope that answers your question, Ranjit, and I'll move to the next one in the interest of time. So we have next question from Tarun. In fact, we have 2 questions from Tarun. What are the parameters which decide sample size for phase 1, and what exactly is 3 layers of approval at DCGI, SEC, Technical Review Committee and Apex Committee. So thanks for those two questions, Tarun. So the sample size in phase 1 is again determined by various factors. It all depends on, what is the drug under consideration, what is the, what is the pharmacological action, and what is the intent, finally what is the, the indication that we are going to use that drug for. So it is a kind of, factor of these multiple considerations. Also, depending on whether it's a first in man study, whether it's a study where, we have done some phase 1s and we are now trying to test different permutations and combinations, that will also decide sample size. And typically this is the call of a statistician, looking at what kind of confidence level we are looking at, what is the statistical significance we are looking at, and what indication we are going after. Talking about the regulatory mechanism, today there are 3 layers of approval for any clinical trial or new drug approval. First, the application will go to the subject expert committee. Subject expert committees are therapy area specific. So for different therapy areas, there are different subject expert committees, and we have 25 such expert panels functioning today. After a particular proposal is cleared by the SEC, it goes to the technical committee. Technical committee is chaired by the Directorate General of Health Services, and he is the highest level of technical expert within the Ministry of Health, and they will do their second review, and if found appropriate, finally the application will go to the Apex committee, which is chaired by the Secretary of the Ministry of Health, and they will ensure that appropriate therapeutic and technical review of every proposal has happened, and only then give a clearance either for the conduct of the clinical trial or marketing of the new drug. So I hope, Tarun, I have been able to answer your questions. Moving to the next one in the interest of time, and this is from Chandra Das. So the question here is that we have a DCGI approval waiver for a clinical trial to be conducted for academic research as per the DCGI Gazette notification published on March 16. Still, regulators do ask for DCGI approvals for simple license application of manufacturing packaging of IMPs by state regulatory authorities. Kindly suggest, it seems the regulation does not get percolated to all levels of authorities, not clear on regulation. I'm afraid that, this is actually getting into a little bit more of specifics, Chanda, so not sure I can, really provide a response here. But yes, I mean, academic research, the guidelines are very clear that there are kind of, if a trial is done purely with academic intent, not with the intention of marketing a particular drug, or if it's a non-regulatory indication, then all you need is a ethics committee approval, and you still have to notify DCGI. If you don't hear from DCGI within 30 days, you can take the approval as deemed approval, and an academician can go ahead with the clinical trial. Now this mustn't be confused with commercial or trials which are done with commercial intent. And typically, I mean, and if there's a change in manufacturing or by definition of Schedule Y, this does not constitute to be a new drug, because a new drug requires a clinical trial. And new drug will be if if your dosage, if you change your dosage form completely, or if you change route of administration, only then it will be deemed as new drug. So my recommendation will be to have a specific discussion with the regulatory authorities in this regard, and really understand what is driving the clinical trials. So sorry, since it's a specific case, I don't think I can comment much more on that. One question from Anang, an interesting question. What is the contribution of pharma companies to increase the number of clinical trials in India? Well, I think, if we can demonstrate to the pharma companies that India is a destination of choice for clinical trials, they will definitely be interested in doing clinical trials in India, because India definitely is a market. You talk of any indication today. I mean, we talked about the triple disease burden in India. That makes India a unique geography where you need drugs for lifestyle disorders, you need drugs for infectious diseases, you need vaccines, you need nutritional supplements. I don't think any other country in the world today has the healthcare needs that we have. So certainly it's a go-to destination for pharma. And if they have to sell their drugs in India, they do definitely need clinical trials in India. I think what is important is dissemination of the message that India now has balanced regulations. The regulators in India are supportive of clinical research, and they are working very closely across the stakeholders to make sure that the balance is retained on the clinical trial regulation front. That is what I think, I all of us, and if we can give that message effectively, pharma companies will definitely want to do more trials in India. One more question from Monica. Why do some biologics and medicinal entity get clinical trial waivers and others not? Do we have transparency on that data? Example, pneumococcal vaccine by MNC to be introduced in India. Has it undergone clinical trials in India with new formulation? Okay, so I will, again, I cannot talk of the specifics of this particular vaccine, but let me talk about what is the general procedure about, or what are the general thinking process for a particular trial getting waiver or not getting waiver. So generally, if you look at recommendations of the Ranjit Roy Chaudhary committee report, or you look at even the Drug Technical Advisory Board meeting minutes, which are all on the website, the thought process is that if there is an unmet medical need, and if one wants to bring out a particular new molecule or a new medicine for an unmet medical need, clinical trial waiver is granted against some condition, and most commonly that condition is to do some kind of post-marketing surveillance study and submit that report to DCGI. Of course, every new medicine cannot be kind of granted waiver under this condition to say that it's an unmet medical need. It really has to be an unmet medical need and a life-threatening condition where one has to demonstrate that the patients will suffer if this particular medicine is not made available. And then we have seen that the regulators often consider giving a waiver. The other area is that if there is enough Indian subjects who have taken part in global clinical trials for that particular formulation. Let's say we have a new drug, let's say for diabetes. India was part of global clinical trials, and one has reasonable data in Indian population to show that the drug has been effective and safe in Indian population. Even in some such conditions, the regulators would consider giving a waiver to the local clinical trial, and they will obviously want to see how the drug is behaving in the market, and that's why they will always ask for some PMS data to be submitted. Okay. There is a question from Faiza Sonawala, and I don't think we've got the question fully, but I think I get what it is. So her question is that whether we have any new regulations for India which talks about risk-based monitoring approach as proposed by US FDA. No, currently, Faiza, there are no such guidelines available. And frankly speaking, I would think that right now we really, I mean, if I look at priorities from the perspective of even regulators, I mean, there are several priority areas, but I think the priority really should be on strengthening the on-the-ground governance over clinical trials and making sure that the approval process is further streamlined. So in my view, at least, little more time before we can go to risk-based monitoring. But I'm sure one day we will be there. So let's hope that that day comes soon and we are, over some of our usual issues, if I may say so. Then one more question here is from K. N. Sridhar. And the question is, currently cell and tissue-based therapies are regulated under drugs. When do you envision we will have relevant regulations for these types of advanced therapies? Uh, Again, very relevant question. And we do know that there are some deliberations happening on the regulatory front, specifically for the stem cell based therapies. So a little difficult to say exactly when this will happen, but my personal opinion will be that we all know that there is a bill that is pending in Parliament, the Drugs and Cosmetic Act Amendment Bill. This bill actually is intending to streamline the regulations further and also build capacity. And I think we will first have to, wait for, that bill to be introduced, to be implemented before we can really talk about any such advances. Because in my view, we first have to make sure that the basic system starts functioning well, and then we have enough resources available to look at specialized aspects such as this. So answer really from my perspective, not really in immediate future, but it's encouraging to note that some discussion has already started in this front. Okay, one more question from Chanda Das again. We have a clinical trial to be conducted outside India, but we face a lot of issues in getting the export NOC for the reasons of not having approval from DCGI office for manufacturing packaging of IMPs in India. Please suggest how to go about it. My apologies. I think this is a very specific situation, and without knowing the specifics, really not possible for me to comment. But whenever you have a situation such as this, my recommendation will be to have a very honest and open dialogue with the regulators. My experience has been that they always kind of listen to you, and they will kind of let you know what exactly the bottleneck has been. Okay, what other questions do we have? Okay, we have one more question from Sanjay Pathania. He says that, Madam, as you said, India is a lucrative place to conduct clinical trials for pharma companies, but I want to know, India is a place where we cannot afford high prices of drug, and if any company spends high amount of money, how they get ROI? Could you please help us to understand how the government is promoting or help such stakeholders to conduct clinical trials? Okay, so pricing of drugs is a very complex subject. Typically what I have seen is that most companies have a differential pricing strategy, which means that even if they have spent a very high amount of money in bringing out a new clinical trial, conducting clinical trial and bringing out a new drug, they wouldn't kind of equally distribute that cost across various countries. They would look at the potential of a country and what is the purchase price parity, and they would come up with appropriate pricing. And this is really a debatable subject, as what can be considered affordable for a country like India, where you have several people unfortunately living below poverty line, but you also have many Indians making in the the list of rich and famous in the world. But I think that government does try to strike a balance by having measures such as the drug price control order, and this is a kind of an ongoing debate that's happening. So I hope that answers your question. I think with that, I think we have, okay, so there's one more question, sorry, from Dr. Pankaj Thakur. Is surprise DCGI inspection happening at Indian sites? Is there a change in the trend of inspection and at par with US FDA inspection? Very good question. Thank you, Pankaj, for that question. So what we have seen is that DCGI inspections are happening. Not all DCGI inspections are surprise inspections. We do get notice. And our dialogue with the regulators has been on two fronts when it comes to DCGI inspections. One, no doubt that these inspections are necessary, but if we have all inspections as surprise inspections, we may have situations that we will have, the inspector will arrive at the site and the investigator will not be available at the site, not knowing that an inspection was planned that day. So surprise inspections should really be reserved for those situations where, they demand more of a for cause investigation, and normal inspections, the routine inspection should happen always with a forewarning, because not because it gives time to investigator to fix things or whatever, but simply because he can make sure that the relevant people and the relevant documents are made available. Secondly, I think we have a long way to go to be at par with US FDA. That's something, an aspiration. I know that the regulators are very open to investing in this area, and we have offered our complete collaboration to the regulators, because we can bring a lot of learnings to the table by our experience of US FDA and EMEA inspections. So we are happy to contribute as a society in every possible way, be it training of the inspectors or be it providing some educational material to them. And I know that the intent is definitely there from the regulators' end to make sure that the inspections are as kind of regularized. They are a regular feature and they do not happen just as, on and off phenomenon, and that they bring up the level of the inspectors. So Pankaj, I hope that answers your question. There is one more question from Krishnanan. Are there any joint efforts from ISCR and DCGI to empower trial sites across India and bring them up to pace of the changing guidelines in terms of clarification? So I can certainly talk about, what we are doing as ISCR. We have always, it has always been our endeavor that all stakeholders of clinical research understand what the current regulations are and what we must do for implementation of those. So we, we do at least one training program in each of the 4 regions of the country, North, West, South and East, where we invite ethics committee and investigators and industry players to come and understand what the current regulations are. We have experts in the industry as well as on the regulator side come and talk about current regulations, what are the challenges in implementation and how to overcome that. In addition to that, we do countless programs. We reach out to individual ethics committees and groups of investigators where we talk to them about revised regulations and in terms of also implementation of those regulators. In parallel, we also work very closely with the regulators, making sure that we give comments on all the new regulations. We highlight if there are any challenges in the implementation. We also support regulators in terms of, introducing guidance document that helps in implementation of various regulations, etc. So we have been working very closely with the regulators in, many of the new regulations that you have seen, and we will continue to do so. So I do hope that answers your question, Krishnan.